couple nights ago, I watched the documentary on Lacey Peterson, and I was not prepared to be as affected as I was. And I got to the end, and I was sobbing, and I'm not a crier. I don't like crying. My son was kind of like, oh, what do we do now? There's a number of times that her story felt familiar. The reactions and the descriptions of the husband felt familiar. My dad, at one point when he was aware of my situation, and my dad does not say much about, he doesn't intrude on relationships. My God, Laura, you need to get out or I'm going to see you on a 60-minute special. You're going to be dead. And so every time I see one of these documentaries, I think I felt that way, and other people felt that way.
I'm Todd, and I was naughty. I did everything wrong. I got kicked out of art school, I drank heavily, and I looked to other religions and versions of spirituality to get fulfilled. The problem was, I was in the occult and I didn't even know it. My life was a wreck, and I had to learn what it meant to have a relationship with Jesus.
And I'm Laura. I was super nice. I did everything right. I got saved young, went to Moody Bible Institute, got married, and followed the Christian rules to having a good life. Problem was, that formula didn't work. I had to change how I related with Jesus.
At the end of the day, what I learned is the very simple truth. Jesus is the answer, and the only one that will ever actually fulfill you.
Naughty versus nice.
And welcome back to Naughty versus Nice. Of course, I am Todd.
And I'm Laura.
There we go, right? You kind of had your own thing there.
No, I did.
Say my name.
My lovely wife, producer Kelly. You are very lesbian chic today, dear, I must say, with your outfit and everything. So,
wow.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I hate it when mom and dad fight.
So here we're about to do a series. Then if you thought some of the other stuff we said is controversial, just hold on to your hats. When we put this idea together and doing the show title for it, Naughty versus Nice, the idea was, look, there's a lot of stuff that I'm aware of and that I know about. If I'm close to being an expert on anything, it's the occult. It's the bad guys. How they do stuff, how they think, what their beliefs are, their philosophies, and how this stuff gets integrated into culture. And if there's an area that I would argue you are an expert on, it would be concepts of marriage, concepts of divorce from a biblical lens, from the good lens of it, and areas in which the church needs some improvement. And not only that, but then you layer on top of it just theology in general. I'm a man. I learned from a woman. What's the world turning into? So it's the theology. It's looking through the lens, that biblical lens, and then being able to interact with life and apply it to life in a way that it changes perspectives on things. You permanently become changed as a result of looking through that biblical filter. And that's an area that I would say, if you're an expert on anything, it's in this area, and this kind of thing. And so what we're going to do is we're going to combine both of those together. We're going to do a series where we talk about marriage, relationships, divorce. Is it biblical? If not, and everything that goes back and forth and in between, including areas that can be disturbing to some people, like abuse, and we're not going to pull any punches. We're going to talk about what that really does look like. And in other areas as to how does showing up and being healthy, how does that look, and how does that show up in not only marriages, relationships in general, as well as in the church, because the church does do a number of things that are good, that are positive and show up well. I just want to kind of prep all this stuff because sometimes we just jump right into conversation as though everybody's been sitting with us the whole entire time through the week or all the other conversations we've had before. And I want to make sure that as we approach this sensitive issue and as we approach this difficult issue, there's a platform by which this show can stand on and other people can get an idea of what direction we want to go with this.
And we've talked about just making sure we start it, at least from my perspective, we start this series and maybe every episode with a very strong disclaimer each time. I'm going to speak about marriage and divorce of a certain group of people. And so with abusive situations, what the church is doing right and wrong with handling women particularly who are coming and have bad situations. I'm not talking about every single marriage. I'm talking about a certain kind. And so for a while, it may feel like you're hearing, I'm some of my frustration, yes, you're going to hear some of my frustration. That I dislike marriage, it's not true. I have 3 boys. One of them is married. I deeply want them to know that experience. I think it's a good one. I think it's one of the most sanctifying experiences for people. It's something that I have no problem with. I don't hate men. I don't hate marriage. I just want to be very clear about that. And if it comes off strong with my frustration with where I see the church working, I want listeners to understand it's been 13 years and I have dealt with probably over 25 women. The number grows monthly, and the situation is the same, and they're not from my community. They're from not other countries. Sorry, I'm not that popular.
Counties, right? Yeah.
Other states,
yeah.
People I don't know, and the trends of what abuse looks like show up, and the trends of how the church responds are showing up. And I don't think you can be online and not see story after story after story of people being sent back to situations that they shouldn't have been sent back to, and some of them are dead. And so that's just my disclaimer is I'm going to come off really negative. Please take it in the context of my experience and what I really desperately want, especially men in leadership, to hear. And I really desperately want to see that, because we're not getting women out. In addition, another disclaimer is I've planned out at least 5 or 6 episodes. I have ridiculously outlined them because I want to do this well. We will get to, in I think episode 2, more what is marriage, what is the purpose of marriage. We'll go there. There will be a lot more of filling those things in. A lot of tonight is my personal experience, and then some of how the church is interacting and what they think about this issue. So that's kind of my 2 disclaimers. Do you have any disclaimers, Todd?
I have a bunch of things that'll probably kind of come up as we go. This is one of those things where anybody can understand being soured over something or having challenges with something or maybe having some heat on something or something like that. The idea that somehow, some way, we're supposed to be rosy and happy all the time and everything's just going to be okay, there is a part of that is also a contributing factor to all this stuff. Look, I tend to lean towards, everything's the devil and, the sky's a little bit grayer, even though it's blue and cloudless, That's just my predisposition type or whatever. But it also gives me the ability to look at certain topics, certain subjects that a normal person, just a straight up normal person, they won't ever want to look at. I know more about horrors and how the occult shows up in the physical real world than I ever wanted to. For people that think everything's great, all my experiences inside the church have only been positive, only been fantastic. Look, man, it's great. God's blessed you. You've never really had anything super horrible happen. You've never had anything super challenging happen in this arena of what we're talking about. We're talking intimate partner abuse and those kind of things. That's great. Somebody in your life has been. Somebody in your family has been. Your brother, your sister, whoever. 1 in 4 in very religious households, women experiences some kind of intimate partner violence, I think is what the term is that they use for it in this study that I can reference. We'll have Kelly put up the notes. 1 in 9 men. So this is not a uniquely woman thing. This is both. However, women disproportionately experience this type of stuff. My point is this. You can sit there and go, this isn't happening in the church. These 2 don't know what they're talking about. This is all a bunch of ridiculous nonsense. Why would I listen? Here's why. Because you have a sister, because you have a brother, you have a niece, a nephew, a cousin, you have an aunt, an uncle, the woman in the cubicle next to you, the woman in the pew next to you. Somebody in your life is experiencing these things. One of the reasons that it continues, we don't like looking at things that make us uncomfortable. And we're not educated about them. Most people don't want to engage in a topic that they're uneducated on. This is it. This is your chance, your opportunity to get educated on a topic, to look at it through a lens, to see it for what it is. No punches pulled. So that way, when it does show up in your life, you're able to identify it, you're able to recognize the signs, and you're able to be of service to others, to wash their feet and put them into a position where you can maybe even go as far as advocate for them or at a minimum encourage them to get help that they need.
I think that was a good long disclaimer. So good job.
Thank you. I guess it's not really a disclaimer, huh? It's more of a reason why.
It's a lecture. We got a lecture.
Look, man, this is serious stuff, and people don't like looking at stuff they don't want to look at. And people need to look at this stuff. You know, it just, that's why we're doing it. It matters. It's really important.
Well, and I think there are a couple of different issues in my life. One of them probably would be women teaching. And I don't mean pastoring. I just mean teaching. And, but more primarily the issue of abuse, understanding the importance of divorce, understanding the context of the passages that speak about it. I feel like my head is probably bleeding from banging my head on the wall, and people keep saying the same things back. So I hope they hear. I hope they do. Something I was going to talk a little bit about my own experience. I wanted to talk about what I believed 20 plus years ago and how that's changed. But I wanted to read an article, and I want it to kind of sit in people's minds because there's some themes in it that I think we've all heard. And as I read it, I wouldn't be surprised if you're listening and you think, well, yeah, that's correct. Okay. So this is an article, What are the Biblical Grounds for Divorce, from Got Questions. I don't know if that's gotquestions.org. That's right. When discussing what the Bible says about divorce, it is important to keep in mind the words of Malachi 2:16. I hate divorce, says the Lord God. Just a side note, there's no context given. Okay. Whatever grounds the Bible possibly gives for divorce, that does not mean God desires a divorce to occur in those instances. Rather than asking, is blank a grounds for divorce, often the question should be, is blank grounds for forgiveness, restoration, and or counseling? The Bible gives two clear grounds for divorce: sexual immorality from Matthew 5:19, and abandonment by an unbeliever for 1 Corinthians 7:15. Even in these two instances, though, divorce is not required or even encouraged. The most that can be said is that sexual immorality and abandonment are grounds and allowance for divorce. Confession, forgiveness, reconciliation, and restoration are always the first steps. Divorce should only be viewed as it says a last resort. I was going to say very last resort. Are there any grounds for divorce beyond what the Bible explicitly says? Perhaps, but we do not presume upon the Word of God. It is very dangerous to go beyond what the Bible says. The most frequent additional grounds for divorce that people inquire about are spousal abuse, emotional or physical, child abuse, addiction to pornography, drug, alcohol use, crime, imprisonment, and mismanagement of finances, such as a gambling addiction. None of these can be claimed to be explicit biblical grounds for a divorce. That's not true. That does not necessarily mean, though, that none of them are grounds for divorce which God would approve of. For example, we cannot imagine that it would be God's desire for a wife to remain with a husband who physically abuses her and or their children. In such an instance, the wife should definitely separate herself and the children from the abusive husband. However, even in such a situation, a time of separation with the goal of repentance and restoration should be the ideal, not necessarily immediately beginning divorce proceedings. Please understand, by saying that, the above are not biblical grounds for divorce. We are definitely not saying that a man, woman whose spouse is engaging in such activities should remain in the situation. If there's any risk to self or children, separation is a good and appropriate step. Another way to look at this issue is to differentiate between biblical grounds for divorce and biblical grounds for divorce and remarriage. Then he kind of goes into some other things, and you can look up the article if you'd like. The point was, there's things in there that are absolutely true. And we live in a culture, and even in my generation, where let's just divorce. We don't get along. It's money issues. It's this and that. But I don't think this article addresses every passage that talks about divorce, because it doesn't. It thinks it does, but the church is just always focused on those two. Those two, if you want to begin wrestling with it before I get to it in episode 3, Jesus says only sexual immorality, and Paul says only abandonment. So you have the two most prolific speakers in the New Testament disagreeing. Essentially, you have to reconcile that, because Jesus didn't say and abandonment, and Paul didn't say and sexual immorality. So what do? And nobody wants to talk about that. You ask people that, and they're kind of like, well, it's kind of what I've been told, so this is what we're going to do. So before I sound like I'm judging everyone, this was what I believed. So 20 years ago, more than that now, because we were first married, we had already had kids, and there was a single woman in our congregation that we attended at the time, and she had a child. And another person in the church would take the child and watch them for that person. And I thought she should have been more careful to get in that situation. I was super judgy. I certainly thought that that could have been avoidable. The other situation was there was an abusive marriage. The church stood with the husband. The woman had left. But I remembered her telling me that he was so controlling that the pillows had to be arranged a certain way when he got home. And I remember thinking, I don't know if this is right, but these are my views and I have to stick to them because that's what's biblical. So if you have any of the views that I'm butting up against, I did too. Perhaps, like Todd said, there's going to be somebody who comes along and you're going to walk through it with them, and you have to, your circumstances are going to make you change your mind, because it's just that. It's real when it's you. It's not real until it's you.
A lot of times we think of abuse and we think of only the physical end of it. And once again, that one statistic that I was citing before, 1 in 9 men are abused by their spouses. Likely not necessarily they're getting tuned up each night because the pillows weren't arranged properly on the couch. Women tend to abuse using things like reputation destruction and psychological stuff. Men do that as well. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying this is an isolated thing. The point that I'm trying to make is that those scars are on the inside of the person. They're not easy to see. It's not like somebody's putting cigars out on the arm of a 7-year-old that they always have to wear long sleeves, even 90-degree weather. That's your first sign something's wrong going on in that kid's household. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. The scars, when they're on the inside, they're hard to see. They come out in behaviors. They come out in peculiarities. They come out in ways that if we're unable to identify what those things are and see, because it's patterns, by the way, this isn't random stuff. A person gets psychologically harmed by someone that they trust in an intimate way, and it shows up in one of 500,000 different ways. It's going to show up in one of 12 ways. Mm-hmm. This is something that can be studied. This is something that can be charted and graphed, and you can see it showing up. So that's one of the ways in which this material matters, this subject matters. It's very easy to, like you were saying, not have life experience. You're 20-something years old. You already know everything already. I promise you, by the time you get to the other side of 50, you'll be more than eager to say, I didn't know nothing when I was 20. And the amount that I've learned since then, it's startling and shocking. And it's almost embarrassing, to say, to look back and go, yeah, that was, I made a good decision then,
I think if you catch yourself saying, I believe exactly the same things, even theologically, that I believed 30 years ago, and you're 50, you probably are wrong. Because we're wrong. We're just wrong. And if you're growing and you're searching, you're going to see where you're wrong.
You haven't grown. You're lifing wrong.
Yeah. So there. I'm sorry, just kidding. So you guys did not know me. You've never known me married. I guess you've always known me as the bitter divorcee. Just kidding. I'm not bitter. Mostly. So I was going to it's always different. I just kind of go with it. What details come out in the story come out. But if there's something that you're like, hey, what was this or whatever, obviously you can. But a couple nights ago, I watched the documentary on Laci Peterson, and I was not prepared to be as affected as I was. And I got to the end, and I was sobbing, and I'm not a crier. I don't like crying. My son was kind of like, oh, what do we do now? There is a number of times that her story felt familiar. The reactions and the descriptions of the husband felt familiar. My dad, at one point when he was aware of my situation, and my dad does not say much about, he doesn't intrude on relationships. My God, Laura, you need to get out or I'm going to see you on a 60-minute special. You're going to be dead. And so every time I see one of these documentaries, I think I felt that way. And other people felt that way. Did that happen? No, obviously, I'm sitting here. But because something doesn't happen doesn't mean that the very real threat of it existed. And the dedication of the show and the heart of the mother, I think, in doing the documentary was that people, it was dedicated to the people who heard her story and got out, and it was dedicated to the people who didn't. And I think that's what I want you to hear in the story. This isn't about me blaming my ex-husband. It's not about trying to ruin someone's reputation. This is me. I want, if somebody is in this, I want them to get out, and I want them to know what they're looking at, and I want them to have one place where there was something scriptural and biblical worldview that supported that decision. So that's where it starts. I had been married 13 years, and we were very, very poor. And we had a computer that had been given to us, and the computer died. And a friend had offered to recover the hard drive and put it on a laptop to give us. And in the background of my mind, I just, for some reason, I think we know things we don't know we know. I thought, I need to ask my husband if there's anything he would be embarrassed about to be found on this computer. And the answer was, well, you might be, but I wouldn't be. And of course, if you've picked up on my personality from the show, I don't take that very well. I was like, wait, what? What's happening? Let's ask 20 questions. Eventually, it came to a conversation where I asked what was going on, what was on this computer, and he said, you have a choice. You can choose to keep trusting me and following me, or you can end that. And then he left for the day. And there aren't a lot of times I felt like the Lord said something very clearly, but he said, you are going to ask, and it is going to destroy you. This isn't going to be a good answer. And so a little bit gear up. It's going to get ugly. And I had no idea at the time. Some abbreviated version is that we did have a discussion. It became clear that pornography had been a part of his life since we first got married. And he wasn't not remorseful. He just wasn't very concerned with my feelings. If you're a woman and you've been told this or suspected it, it feels physically like you're ill. I just wanted to just curl up and die a little. It's far more painful than people think it is. We had a conversation. I could tell he felt better. He had kind of confessed, and I think he felt better. And I asked him, for love of me, would he consider not doing it? And he said, I tried that before in the past, and that's not enough of a reason. And I thought, okay, that doesn't make sense. I kept it to myself for several weeks. I ended up randomly telling somebody who I was friends with, but not incredibly close with. And she and her husband reached out to my husband and said, this is something we've dealt with. We're happy to walk alongside you if you want help. And he was not happy. And I, again, in about 6-week period, I approached and said, would you consider talking to this spiritual leader in our lives and her husband? And he said, I will do it if you want me to, but if they're going to tell me this is sin and try to fix me, I'm not going to allow you to put that Band-Aid on me. And I thought, I don't know what this is, but this isn't the normal response. And we met with that couple, and afterward, what she said was, he is so hard. He is so, so hard. I don't think this is going to go well. He had claimed that pornography was like appreciating a beautiful sunset. He implied that it's based on just my inadequacy overall. And I don't remember what I asked him, but I was sobbing next to him at the table. And he just looked at me and just shrugged his shoulders like, okay, So now I'm starting to realize that my husband, who I had considered a believer, which I don't know if I disagree with that now, but I'm just saying at the time, I thought we were all on the same page. We were not on the same page. He did not think it was sin. The way that he explained it, he had built a theological construct. Normally, if men are going to try to excuse it under the gospel, it's under the blood, some kind of casual thing. No, he had embraced something called full preterism. And in that system of beliefs, they believe that Jesus Christ has returned at the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And in that time, that was his second coming. And so everything that's proceeded from 70 AD is the kingdom of God. And we are his commanding priests. And our job is to be in the world and overtake it and take the sinful things and sift it through the gospel and then make them useful for the kingdom. And so he felt that pornography was research in order to improve marriages. He thought I should participate with him, support him blindly, love him more than God. That was something he said. and he was going to instruct my children in it at a certain age. Those were all statements that came out in the next several months. I feel like I've talked a lot. It's time when I have to give Todd the time to talk.
No, it's...
Is there anything you want?
Here's one of the points that I want to make is that, as we kind of covered all this stuff and we were saying before, we're not encouraging divorce for absolutely everybody. There's narrow situations for this stuff. This is the point that we're trying to make. This is not a normal situation. This isn't sorry, honey, but ever since college, you know what I mean? I was in the fraternity with all those guys. Porn has kind of got in there, and then it's been a part of my life ever since. I want to be rid of it. I don't feel good. I don't want to have anything to do with it. I don't want this sin and this burden. I want you and God and healthy. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about somebody wrestling with the flesh. We're talking about somebody who's embraced the flesh, who's embraced the sin, who's justified it biblically, who's created an entire theological framework based off of an existing framework. He's built scaffolding onto this thing. And not only that, but he's like, and we're going to teach the boys. Mm-hmm. We're going to show them the beauty of, whatever. Okay. I was trying to come up with a funny title to something in my head and I couldn't come up with it fast enough. Look, we're not talking about the guy who is genuinely racked with guilt and upset, relieved it's been found out, but also now ready to work with his family in order to go on the long road in the struggle in order to, do everything he can to mitigate this at a minimum, but overcome it ideally through Christ in order to come out the other side and have a stronger family and a stronger relationship and a greater appreciation for the depth and the sacrifice of God. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about more of a Hannibal Lecterian kind of thing where it's like, I ate the guy's liver and I had a nice Chianti with it and fava beans and, that kind of thing. Like there's no apology. There's no there's no remorse. There's no any of that stuff. And just to put that into context, people say, well, you can't support the idea of divorce unless it's within this context. Jesus, I'm about to go into like an area that I don't want to go to necessarily, but it's like you had said, look, these are the two things. They're in conflict with each other. We've got to try to reconcile that within the Bible of what Paul says and what Jesus says. Inside of those things, inside of that, there's like psycho and non-psycho. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. We're talking about healthy people. We're talking about normal people. We're talking about normal situations. We're talking about normal people and normal stuff. Then, in that context. And that's what the church thinks everybody's always talking about. Healthy marriage, healthy thing. He slipped up. What's the problem? I kind of get that argument at a certain point. That's not what we're talking about. I mean, we're talking about more like Hannibal Lecter stuff. We're talking big bad wolf kind of stuff.
So are we talking about something else?
I love when she says that. It makes
Did I take that too far? Did I go off on a tangent or something?
We're a bit rambly.
I've seen enough people have this weird hard line where it's like, like I always say, okay, people, did you, seriously? I saw that.
What did you do?
I think I just rolled my eyes.
She totally rolled her eyes. She's like, he's talking on the podcast again. Like, what is going on? Talking about divorce, lady.
I was rolling my eyes at me because I was like, you got him going again. Great. Like, you should have kept your mouth shut.
We can just rewind all this stuff and re-record all over it. And I'll be like, no, I'm fine. You go ahead. You continue.
Anyway, Laura. Okay. We're talking about a very, very specific type of marriage that is happening under people's noses within church settings and people coming and asking for help. Let's get back to
the story.
Yes,
story time.
The Lifetime.
Right.
8 o'clock movie.
I've in the women I've dealt with since this has happened, I've never encountered one like mine. Never. There's something of what would be now categorized as a covert narcissist. It's associated with a higher IQ, and that fits my story. So the things that were pouring out of his mouth after this discovery are not things I overtly knew about. I can look back now through counseling and see it was from day one. Someone just asked me the other day, was he always like that, or did he just become that later? And it's like, yeah, he was, and then it just grows. He was what he was.
He just took his mask off after.
Once I held that line, and this became a 9-month period of time in which we were still together and living together, and this was the conversation. He was very angry, very cruel, very mean. In just every level of a relationship that can exist, he was those things in it. At times he would say, we were not fighters. We didn't fight in front of our kids. So they go to bed and like this, thing would come out. I got sent away, told I would be sent away, that I would now return to my father, which I thought was just so interesting, and that I could leave the kids. My internal dialogue was, over my dead body, I will never leave these kids. That's not going to happen. But then he would come back that same evening and be like, well, I've decided to let you stay because, who would pick up the kids from school if you're not here? And I said, am I good for only that? And he said, yes, I'm going to stay married to you until the kids are gone, and then I'm going to leave you. Okay. Then the next day it would be, I don't see why you think we have a problem. Everything's fine. You're the one that's crazy. He had me convinced I was crazy. It required his best friend on the phone with me describing what it's like to deal with a crazy person and saying, you're not wrong. He's making you think you're wrong. We're talking about 9 months of psychological games where statements like, you have to submit to me, there's no choice. God would have you love me, obey me more than him. You're a prude. The reason that I had to pursue pornography is you were not a whore. You weren't whore-like enough. It would just go from level to level, and I didn't even know who I was married to anymore. And I didn't see this. It was there, but it was veiled. But once I touched what he didn't want to let go, it was on, and we were not living in warfare. Like, the kids knew something was wrong, but they didn't know enough about, it wasn't like we're fighting and throwing vases at each other. It was all very contained, but terrifying. So we had been recommended to go to counseling. We went to a counselor, and if you are told to go to counseling, marriage counseling with a narcissist, you should say no. These are all things that my friend and I learned after the fact. You will go, they will say somewhat kinder things or talk like they're willing to talk about the marriage, and then the 45-minute trip home would just be being ripped apart and ridiculed. And so don't do it. If that's the case, he needs to go. You can just do your own.
I read somewhere, too, that going to marriage counseling with the narcissist, all you're doing is putting out there the things that he can control and manipulate better.
Yes. More words are more toys. That's the standard phrase in my head. Don't give them toys to play with. Just don't give them.
I want to jump in real quick on a second here, and here's a key point to make. If you're listening to this and you're saying, well, it sounds a little bit like my friend Susan's marriage or stuff that she's talked about, one of the ways that you can identify that there's abuse going on is there's a push-pull. There's a give and take. There's a, baby, why do you make me so angry? You know I don't like to be this kind of person. Why do you got to say that? You make me so angry and I can't control myself to, I'd never hurt you. I'm so sorry. I would never be mean to you. It's that push-pull. And that's what you were describing. It was 1 minute he's hot and, it's unpredictable and outrageous things. And the next minute it's, soft and sweet. And then not only that, but then it's like you start drawing lines on something and you start think, okay, what's my worth in this? Your worth is the smallest amount of worth that could possibly exist. That's what he's attempting to communicate. So in the process of all of this, not only are you getting pulled, your abuser becomes the one who gives you comfort, but then they're also reminding you that you are of no value and insignificant the entire time in the process. And it chips away and chips away and chips away. This does not happen overnight. It doesn't. And for the people that are subjected to this for decades, they become different people. Just going through this just for 6 months is enough to completely alter the personality of someone done relentlessly in this fashion. The other thing that I wanted to say is that the idea of the narcissist has become popular. It's getting exposed. And with YouTube channels, people are learning about it, finding out it's a real thing. Behavioral borderline personality disorder, whatever the terms are. How do you know if you're with a narcissist? How do you know? They've never admitted anything's their fault ever. It doesn't matter the significance of it. It doesn't matter how big it was, and it doesn't matter how small it was. It's never their fault. Start there. Do you have a memory of your husband or your wife ever admitting anything was ever their fault ever? Or is anytime they say something's their fault, it's they say, you said it was my fault. Not they're admitting it. You're right. This is my fault. I missed garbage day or whatever it is. And, I'm a goof. I'll just have to put a reminder on my phone and make sure I don't miss it. It doesn't matter the smallest thing like missing garbage day to the largest thing like I crashed the car. These are things to really pay attention to and know.
And in the Christian's home, something else to look for, because I thought back later, I don't think I ever saw that. You should see with your most intimate partner, their growth as a believer would involve learning, kind of like they didn't know. I'm not saying he never learned, but like I turn corners and there's remorse for how I've mishandled something. There wasn't that. There wasn't I think I sinned kind of stuff. Like I'm aware of when I sin, and not just to my spouse or my kids. Like I can articulate that. That's a part of growing. That didn't happen. I just didn't catch it because it was such a charming personality all through that you kind of thought you were hearing it. I don't know. That's just something else to look for is how are they interacting with the Lord within the body? And is it the same as how they interact at home? Because there was some of that, like there was behavior at church and behavior at home where it was actually said to me, I'm faking it because I know in several years the Spirit will teach them to be at the level I'm at. And so I'm just pretending until they get to where I'm at. And I was like, oh, okay. That was during it. So he was faking about our situation. So it wasn't just, dispensational versus, whatever. It's just
right.
like
it was
theological
a
stuff.
theological disagreement. You're talking like a completely different level.
So we had been recommended to go to counseling, and he begrudgingly said to go, and or said he would go. We went for a while, and their pornography use would continue. I would ask, I fell into the trap that if I became the perfect wife, this wouldn't continue to happen. And so you add that element, and then there's a sense of failure on you consistently in the mix of all of this weird back and forth. And I had, I'd asked, have you looked at something? And the answer was yes. So we were going to counseling, and the counselor said, why would you do this to your wife? It's akin to stabbing her. That's how this hurts her. You wouldn't stab your wife. And there was this pause, and he said, I would, but then who would be around to clean it up? I was so thrown and tumbled about, I didn't even catch the threat. I told a Bible teacher about it the next day, kind of like, can you believe he said it? And she said, do you understand what position you are in right now? And I did not. I didn't. You don't know what you're looking at because you're somewhat conditioned. It is what it is. I found that out, I believe it was in September. We did not separate until February. That 5 months is, I don't know how to describe it delicately. It's a mind screw. So sorry if that's too forward. I don't know. It was bad. It got to a point where he was frustrated with one of the boys, and my son wasn't doing anything. He had just really looked kind of pouty to be told to do something, and he was sitting on the floor, and my husband was standing over him, and he raised his fist, and I saw it, and I said something, and he wasn't raging. He just raised his fist, and we had a conversation about it, and I said, what do you think you're doing? And he's like, I think this is a form of discipline. By the age of this child, there was no like spankings. This wasn't, physical was not a part of discipline at this age for this child. And he said, I think it's biblical to discipline. It can be biblical to discipline with a fist. And I think it's important in spousal discipline that I can hit you, or something to that effect. And I mean, you can hit me too, but I mean, it's an accepted biblical format of relationship. And I thought, no, now it's my kid. Now I'm done.
Do you see the escalation there? Like, he went from just saying the thing about the knife in the counseling session to then physically raising his fist and giving you that red flag, a visual red flag versus just a verbal red flag.
I mean, I can look back now and see things very early in the marriage where I was subtly trained to never be the angriest person in the room, probably never to get angry. It's my disposition anyway. But there were ways in which that was communicated, and it isn't like everybody thinks it is. It's not black and white where, the husband grabs the wife's arm and drags her from the room. That never happened. But there are other ways and other things that just become clear when you get out of it that, I was being trained to respond in a certain way and stay in a certain position. And part of what pushed him to the brink in the situation was I had become a person who would not give up the line in the sand. Like, the worst thing ever happened for him was me to find about that porn, because that's just not going to be okay. Second worst thing he did was bring my kids into it. I thought, perhaps you did not know my mother, but she was like, when it was done, it was done. That's kind of where I was. But it still took time from that point to really be convinced. You have to understand, if somebody's living in that kind of turmoil, it feels like you're 5 seconds away from an emotional breakdown all the time. You're trying to hold 3 children together. You're trying to hold yourself together. This is happening, and it's all happening when you are alone with them. It doesn't happen in front of other people. It's terrifying. It's horrible. It's all of those things. I finally got to a point where I was ready to leave, and at this point is when I shared with my dad what was happening. And he was like, "This has been happening for months." And nope, Dad, this is happening, and I need you to come with me. And we went to the lawyer together, and we planned a way in which I would leave. I left in secret, so that means I packed up the car during the day, and I had an errand that I was going to run, and I legitimately ran it, so I didn't lie. And at that point, we met and hid our car at another person's house, and my dad, we left town. And that was a very hard day, too, because it's hard to know if you're doing the right thing when you've been conditioned your whole life that this isn't something you should do. And it was incredibly stressful. I was terrified he would find out I'd packed the car. He helped the kids get in the car. And I just remember praying, please don't see the sleeping bags. Please don't see the sleeping bags. I left, and before I left with my dad, I saw my best friend, who is the one who walked through this with me. And we're not either of us huggers. We just hugged, and I just sobbed. I mean, it was a long process for she and her husband as well to walk through this for 9 months and to get me out, and that was everything to me. So at this point, we've separated. I've had our former pastor, or our pastor then, met with him, gave him a letter, said she'd like you to leave the home if you're willing to leave the home. And I want to talk about what happened next, because I think it's something you'll also see as a red flag when you're looking at people's patterns. He agreed he would vacate the premises, and I was going to be out of the city for several days. He called that night, didn't know where I was, left a voicemail for me and said, in tone, "You're being ridiculous. There's nothing to be afraid of." Although for months I would say, "You have fantasized about ways to kill me." Yeah, I have. "You have wanted to hurt me." Yeah, I have. And then treat me like I was crazy for being afraid, but capitalizing on the fear. So that evening, I can't believe you're afraid. I mean, if you decide to come home, you can. You're being ridiculous. The next day, every single friend and every single family member had a call from him in which he gave the exact same speech, and he cried. and it was how sorry he was, and this was, never should have happened, and all this stuff. The minute you get someone crying like that, the first person trying to control the narrative is the person you need to be looking at. And that is something I learned from that. But it was just, he was like all over the board, really sad, really sorry, really remorseful. His family believed that, that's their perspective, or my perspective of what happened. Obviously, there's two sides to every story. So this is mine. That began another 8 or 9 months of separation, in which we did do like what this article said, seeking to be careful to have reconciliation. It would go back and forth, I'm sorry, I'll never do that again. How could you question me? I mean, I have at least 100 emails of the crazy that came out of that 9 months. I mean, you've read them, Kelly. What was your thought?
That they twist your mind. Mm-hmm. 1 minute he's using flowery words and loving and kind and building you up, and then the next minute he's telling you, but you fail in this area, in this area, in this area, which happen to be the same areas that he just built you up in over and over again. But the letters go up and down like that, and you get to the end of it and it's almost exhausting to read. But if you're not looking for that pattern, that up and down, the push and pull, the squeeze and release, as you call it, Todd, then people would read that and look at it and they would say, see, he said right here that he loves you.
And he's sorry.
Yep. And that he's sorry.
And he's going to stop.
Yep. But then it's like we focus on that. And this is coming from Polypositive over here. Okay. Like we all know I focus on the positive stuff. But it's something we have to start looking at the whole. We have to look at the whole letter. We have to look at the whole speech they're giving. We have to look at the whole package and the whole pattern, and not just pick out the tiny little pieces we want to hear.
And I think, I don't know, several years ago, I sent you some, just because I wanted your perspective. And you said, I couldn't finish them. They felt so satanic. And that was probably the most descriptive that anyone has ever been in reading them. They were veiled threats. They were embarrassing details about me given in group emails to people who weren't included in this. I had still met with the counselor that we had met with, and then he had a psychiatrist above him in credentials who would review the emails, trying to determine, because he teetered on the edge of being threat level. So daily, this person is looking at these emails to tell me if I should be afraid I'm going to get killed. And so it was a terrible time. It was daily emails, daily responses, daily consulting with all these different people trying to give advice. So obviously, eventually, I reached a point where I was going to be done. In that process, and this will maybe come out more when we talk about the church in the future episodes, good people don't know how to handle a crazy person. And they look at, like the article said, it's important we see this as sin, forgiveness, redemption, reconciliation, those ideas. That's how they see the world. And they see a guy who fits that pattern. And they want to put the marriage back together, because the message we've received for years and years and years is, God forbid the marriage ends. We can't do that. It's a bad testimony to the world, and God hates it. And so we just need to put you back in a room and get you back together. So we had several people in that group of people working with us from both sides, one of them being our pastor, who are just not equipped to deal with this. They don't know what they're looking at. And so he would be swayed just like I was. Like, well, today I looked in his eyes and I was terrified. I could see why you're scared. The next day, I can't believe you think he's going to hurt you. He's sorry. And it was like that, back and forth, back and forth. And there really weren't a lot of us in that group who had learned to see the world through this scope of where we're at now. One of the major players in it is at that place with me now. She and I both can look back and kind of go, yeah, I wish we'd known that then. But I had consistently had my best friend who, you need one person who's not going to fall for the BS. And that was her. And you just need somebody to anchor you and say, nope, he's wrong. You're right. Because you cannot believe you're wrong. My personality doesn't think I'm wrong. I cannot think he's wrong, is what I meant to say. I always think I'm wrong. So if you criticize me, I'm like, oh my gosh, you're right. Everything is horrible. And that's, my personality draws these kind of guys. That's just how it is. Be what it may. Be that as it may. Is that the phrase? We have a real struggle with words and phrases on this show.
I just want to point out the way you were describing, one day he's looked into his eyes and he's terrified. The next day, oh, I don't know why you're afraid of him. That's just a real life example of making a decision only on what's in front of you at that moment and not taking that step back and being like, wait a minute, yesterday he was scary. The day before he was scary. Why am I not factoring that in?
And there were incidences of porn being purchased during this time. I could prove it. I printed out what had been purchased. I printed out the bank, statement, everything. And everybody just kept still not willing to see that there was a pattern. Again, not because they're evil people. It's because they just don't know what they're looking at, because we've been trained to only see the world through a certain lens.
And I think that's one of the reasons that you and I have gotten along so well in certain ways, because I approach it from the point of view of the occult's everywhere and people can't see it. Good people don't see what's in front of them for what it actually is. And I'm banging the alarm bell on it going, it's the devil, and you in your ministry, especially with young women who are in vulnerable situations, you're seeing things for what they are, and you're banging that alarm bell going, it's the narcissist, or, whatever it is. And once again, the people around are not seeing it for what it is. Not because they're sinister, cooperative, creepy weirdos, but because, at the end of the day, like, there's that phrase again, like a really good, decent guy is not thinking about ways to harm his 9-year-old daughter. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So just the idea that his neighbor's doing it, it's a foreign idea. It's never even occurred to him. So, of course, when he sees some of the signs of abuse, he chalks it up to, well, she's a peculiar kid. Some kids are just weird at that age. Or whatever. Some kids just really like long sleeve shirts in the middle of July, or some whatever, or some women, I guess they just don't look at you and only look at their feet whenever you're talking to them. They don't give you eye contact. I don't know, maybe she was awkward in 3rd grade. They're not out hurting people, so they don't understand. They know that it exists, but it exists in a fictional way. It's not next door. It's not in their church. It's not in the cubicle next to them at work. And so they're not able, not only that, but then they're not able to identify it because since they're not thinking in those terms anyways, they're not getting educated on these subjects, recognizing that these things exist. I'm not saying anybody's got to be an expert on everything. You don't have to know all the different borderline personality disorder types and all the different ways that it shows up. You need to know what a general narcissist is, though. You need to know that if you tell a narcissist no, and you hold the line, they're going to go through a range of behaviors that's almost clockwork, and it's going to get really bad and really uncomfortable. You want to know if you've got a narcissist in your family or in your relationships or whatever, tell them no, and then hold that line and watch what happens. A normal person gets told no, they're like, well, you know what? I really wanted to see the new movie at the Cineplex. We can go to the other place if that's where you want to go. I guess that's fine. It's just I don't like the popcorn they use.
I'm going to just comment on what you were saying a minute ago about getting educated. I think part of that starts with realizing we have to stop looking at it like, oh, did you see what happened in that church over there or that family over there? There's distance to it. There's, this isn't something that will touch us. This is something that touches all of us in many different ways. So we have to start being able to see that and acknowledge that that isn't something over there. That is something right here next to me.
And I heard this phrase within the last year, and I've used it a lot. We normal people, and especially my personality, we sympathize, empathize, and so when somebody does something wrong and then they're sorry, we think they're just a broken version of us. They aren't. They're something other. So them being sorry doesn't mean what I mean when I'm sorry. And so you have to start saying to yourself, he's not like me. He's not a broken version of me. He is something other. He is something other. And start learning to put him in that box, because otherwise you're just seeing him through the lens of who you are. And it doesn't ever you'll never be able to see the pattern without doing that.
And that's just, it's not everybody, okay? But there are some people that are like that, and that's the thing they rely on. What did Christ say? Beware the wolf in sheep's clothing. That's over and over and over again, over and over and over again. And then we keep acting like he never said it. And we keep acting like these people don't exist. But the irony is that we watch movies where the psychopath goes out. What's that one show? Him or Her? What was that one? You. Like that show.
I won't watch that.
That's probably a good idea.
No.
Or,
like,
you know,
this is somebody's show? This was my life. I don't want to do that.
well, that's like that show Dexter. Like,
Yeah,
I know
no.
that I have never seen an episode, and we had a television show where we glamorized and glorified a bona fide serial killer. You know, like, what is going on? And then people act like, well, that's only in entertainment. There's a part of me that thinks that's why that stuff's out there in entertainment, so that way you can't identify it in real life. And you expect it to show up like the television show in this whatever way, when in fact you read the books, you read you read the diagnosis manuals, you read and listen to therapists and read their books. And what's that one book? The Narcissist Handbook. What's that one?
Yeah, The Narcissist Handbook.
Like one of the flat out best books to start with. If you want to know what a narcissist is, read this book. Holy smokes, man. They lay it all out. I'm like, oh, wow, I've seen this before over and over and over again. You might not realize it. You might have a narcissist in your life making it difficult, making it, and you're like, why can I get along with other people, but I can just never get along with this person? It's always my fault. Get educated. Start reading these books and start recognizing what's going on, because it's a big issue, and it doesn't seem to be getting as much of a spotlight as I think it needs.
Is there anything else you wanted to give with your story?
Well, I wanted, before I forget, because I forget things, another book, and I don't think you guys have read it. It's short, and that's why I like it, because sometimes you can't handle a lot during the circumstances. 30 Covert Emotional Manipulation Tactics, How Manipulators Take Control in Personal Relationships.
It is a very good book.
And Kelly will put that in there. I have a lot of resources, and we'll have those up. But that one, it's the closest one, because, see, when you're dealing with somebody who's insidious, who's smart, who does the long game, I mean, we dated for 2 years. I followed the rule. I thought he was fine. You can't see it as easily. It is not as black and white as, I mean, most of the women I've dealt with, I'm like, well, I can see it very clearly. I'm grateful for you. This is obvious. I can textbook this for you. As far as the rest of the story, we did eventually divorce. I was not incredibly supported by that. We can get into all those kind of details when we talk more about the church. That has been 13 years ago, maybe 14. I don't know. The kids, it was hard. You have to see somebody who has hurt you in every arena, in every way, every 2 weeks when you have children together. You watch them hurt your kids. What I can say is each of my boys are phenomenal people who have maturity beyond their age in how they take care of me, and not in a creepy, weird way. They're just appreciative, responsible, well before their time, think the world of the decision, are grateful for it, and are the closest siblings I've ever seen. The closest. And they're close with me, but as a parent, you rejoice that they're close with one another, because I'm going to go away. They'll have each other. That's my joy, is that they love each other this way. And I questioned it once, and one of my sons says, well, Mom, we're trauma bonded. I've never heard that phrase before. So I was like, yeah, you were. That's, and it was, because a lot of times they went and I stayed home. I didn't go into custody, when they went to have time with them. They had each other, and they always had to look out for each other, and they did. And I love them, and I think they're wonderful. So
I have an older brother and a younger sister, and they don't even know I do this podcast. So
I know, right?
you know what I mean? Like, so
all my siblings listen.
Yeah, right.
Laura, do you want to let everybody know what we're going to be looking at and discussing next week?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've written it out in great detail.
I've seen the notes.
It's really quite phenomenal. Something we didn't get to in this one, which I just mentioned a little bit ago, was some marriage misconceptions and some ideas about divorce that exist in the church. I do want to visit that. We'll move forward. I know at least in episode 2, I want to talk about what biblical marriage is. And I know in episode 3, we're going to talk a lot more about the passages that I mentioned, Jesus and Paul, and what they said about divorce. So there's a lot of stuff people just aren't talking about. When I meet with women, I say these things. I start talking about how God treated divorce in the Mosaic Law and why he treated it that way and what it allowed for women. And they're like, I've never heard that. Absolutely. Almost every single one has said, am I allowed to leave? And can I remarry? And I say yes to both. And I can defend that next time.
One of the things that people don't see up front, your home is supposed to be a place for you that's a sanctuary. It's a safe place. And when you're involved in a situation where you go home and it's volatile and you never know, you feel like you're walking on eggshells the whole entire time. The second place for the believer that is the place of comfort, the place of peace, and the place of rest, the place of membership, community, and belonging, that's the church. And a lot of times people will reach out to the church when they're in a situation that is confusing, it's discombobulating, they know something's wrong, but they don't know exactly what it is, and not everybody in their immediate circle is reinforcing, yes, something's definitely wrong. And they go talk to leadership, and they say, I think something's wrong, and this and that, and this is what happened. And too often the response of good men trying to do good things that don't understand, that are not dumb, they're just uneducated. They don't know what they're looking at, and they don't know what they're seeing. The first response will be something to the effect of, well, he hasn't done anything yet. Too many people have heard that said back to them, and then it's this unintended extra layer, extra helping of abuse that gets heaped onto people in this situation. So,
and I want to support that because that is the phrase, and it was repeated over and over and over by leadership to me. And by the time we were done, he had done things. And they're things it was wrong.
Yeah.
And so when we all went through a similar situation several years later, and people were responding with, he didn't do anything, or he hasn't done anything yet. That is the exact phrase. Unfortunately for you guys, we were on the phone when I unraveled.
Yeah.
Because I'm furious with that response. You have to wait until people are hurt. And now, okay, we'll step in. And now you have enough grounds. You know, that's another phrase I hate. Do you have grounds? I mean, he's sorry now. You don't have grounds. You don't have grounds. It's just.
Men are in position where they're trying to be helpful. They care about the people that are in their community and their church, and they don't realize it, but they're contributing to harm, and they don't know it. And it's this extra layer that happens. So if you're in a situation that's like this in your home, if you have a friend or family member, or you know somebody that is, this is the series that we're going to do, that we ask you to go on this with us as we talk about these difficult subjects and these difficult things, and take an opportunity to see things that are maybe being reflected back to you in your own life, or that you're seeing in the life of somebody else. It puts you in a position where you can be of service to others, to help others, to raise a few red flags if people around you aren't seeming to notice, or at a bare minimum, start getting educated, getting the resources you need in order to be able to put you into a position where you can recognize what's happening and then start taking action. Laura, thank you for sharing everything that you did. I've got intimate stories that I don't want to talk about. I don't want to relive it. I just don't want to. And for you to have the guts to do that, it speaks volumes. So thank you. We do have, of course, a buymeacoffee.com/naughty versus nice page that's getting set up, where we'll put extras, material, resources, commentary for your consumption, I guess would be the term for that. And when I get my act together, I have one shirt designed, by the way.
Good.
Yeah, it's just got the logo on it, but I got a whole other series that I want to do that I think will actually be really cool. I got to run some of these ideas past you.